Thank you to Still Point for having me here, and thank you all for coming tonight and your interest in this topic. I'll be doing a bit of reading and I'll be doing a bit of talking, so we'll go back and forth on this. I'm going to be using a framing device for this lecture, which should allow me to organize it in such a way that captures the vast amount of work that Reich did and to also make some new points about it. This frame is going to be Emanuel Wallerstein's World Systems Analysis. Wallerstein understands modernity to be set in global capitalism, a system that constructs a world that is combined and unevenly developed. It is a system that gives priority to the endless accumulation of capital through the drive for profit. In this system, the various cities, nations, and regions of the world carry out different roles in a global division of labor. The core is the center for financial capital, military hegemony, and the production and dissemination of ideological hegemony. The periphery is the place from which resources are plundered. These resources include both raw materials from the natural world and human labor power from the human physical world. The integration of the core and the periphery through the financing of profit enterprises that plunder the earth also constructs a world ecology. This world ecology is currently being driven towards a state that will be fatal for its human inhabitants. There are also mixed states which function in some ways like core states but are subordinate to the core. These are called the semi-periphery. These relations between state, core, peripheral, and semi-peripheral are functional and dynamic, not static and absolute. Positions and roles change over time due to the vicissitudes of capital accumulation, which are triggered by technological development, political battling, developments in consciousness or Geist. Even within one sphere, for example, the core, there are states that exert hegemony over others and can threaten to shove the other states into the semi-periphery or the periphery. Hegemony, like capitalism, inevitably undermines itself due to its structural contradictions. This mechanism produces cycles, which we call history. Wallerstein defines 4 moments. First, there's a slow decline. Hegemony inevitably undermines itself, so it will decline, no matter what. All hegemonic states decline. Then there's a balance of power between the different states in the system. And then there's a breakup of that balance of power, which leads to war. Since this is a world system, it's a world war. And Wallerstein talks about 30 years wars. And we'll look at that in a second. The winner of the war sets up the new hegemony. And the winner is not necessarily the one who, only the one who is victorious, but it's the one who is least damaged during the war. This is why the victor likes to really punish the defeated at the end. And I think here in Berlin, we have an example of that. After World War II, the United States government punished Berlin block by block, building by building, in a series of revenge punishments that Berlin is still traumatized by to the present day. Wallerstein describes the history of cycles in modernity. It begins with the decline of Spain as a world empire, and then the rise of the English and the Dutch, who excelled at global trade and set up the first joint stock companies in history. Then there occurs a 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, out of which the United Provinces are hegemonic. The cycle starts over again and leads to the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, 1792 to 1815, out of which the United Kingdom emerged hegemonic. The third cycle leads to World War I and II, 1914 to 45, out of which the United States emerged hegemonic. The United States is currently in a state of steep decline. It is no longer clearly hegemonic in the world. Let's consider now the development of Wilhelm Reich's theory and method within the history of these cycles. I'll first sketch this quickly to give you a map and then spend most of the lecture working through an analysis of it. Reich is born in the periphery. He's born in Ukraine. He works as a soldier for the core state, in this case a weak core state, Austria. And he also studies in that same core state. He studies the critique of modernity, psychoanalysis, and Marxism in the core. Then he moves closer to the core of the core. He moves here to Berlin. He develops a radical body-mind psychology and a revolutionary practice here in Berlin. Then he's exiled. He moves to Scandinavia. He develops a radical medicine, which is medical practice, which is called orgonomy. Then he moves to the core hegemonic state of the time, the United States. First to New York, and then up into Maine because he couldn't do his work in New York, it was too polluted. He consolidates his complete system there, including a theory of cancer, which is going to get him in trouble. And he launches explorations into climatology, astronomy, physics, philosophy. He's imprisoned and censored by the hegemonic power of the United States. But his legacy helps to inspire global protest movements in all of the core in the 1960s. I want to suggest that the movements that Reich made across the globe and through his theory and practice, the steps and development of his work were specific responses to the developments in the world system of his time and can be understood in this historical materialist manner. Rather than being seen as a paranoid kooky quack who wanted people to have orgasms in metal boxes, as many, even the educated who should know better, see him, we can see his work as a logical response to a world system that itself is becoming more and more psychotic. Reich is a Marxist neo-Freudian and is influenced not only by Marx and Freud, but also by those that influence Marx and Freud. To find these influences, we can turn to world literature. It's a good place to look at depictions of significant historical periods. World literature registers in its form and content the contradictions and crises of its time. For example, William Shakespeare and Miguel de Cervantes registered in their plays and novels, respectively, the opening shots of the world capitalist system. Now, Reich is obviously not influenced directly by Shakespeare and Cervantes, but Marx and Freud are. And in my research, I've shown that they were formatively influenced and that Marxism and psychoanalysis are fundamentally Shakespearean. They are less so formatively influenced by Cervantes, but a significant intertextual presence of lines and imagery from his novels are in Marx's and Freud's writings. Three Shakespearean mechanisms can be seen traveling through Marx and Freud and into Reich. They are the dialectic, which Shakespeare was working on before Hegel, inversions, and the re-inclusion of the other. Keep these in mind as we work through Reich's work. Now, the Second 30 Years' War, Napoleon's conquest of Europe, is significantly traumatic to the German states, where Reich develops his work. The literary response to this is a German romantic literary movement, especially in the writings of Goethe, Schiller, August Schlegel, Ludwig Tieck, all who were significantly influential for Marx and Freud, and by transfer for Wilhelm Reich. You will notice that Reichian theory in his practice is quite Sturm und Drang. Reich's bodywork literally calls for the overflowing of naturally sourced energy and emotions. Reich was born in 1897 during the arms race among the core states leading up to the Third 30 Years' War of Modernity, World War I and II. He grows up in Ukraine, which at that point was a peripheral area of Austria, which was a weak part of the European core. He is Jewish, but raised secular. His father invested his money in livestock and became a supplier for the German military. And this is one of the functions of the periphery, to supply the core with the materials it needs for its hegemony. In return, the core supplies the periphery with ideology. And this is exactly the case with Reich's father, Leon Reich. He loved the German language and culture, and he raised Wilhelm with an Austro-German identity. Reich is educated at home by German tutors and then attends German grammar school and develops into a young man educated in the language and culture of the core. When the battles of World War I arrived at his region, Reich decided to enlist at a premature age in the Austrian military. This is also a customary function of the periphery to muster bodies to fight for the core. Reich's first move from the Ukrainian countryside to the battlefields of Europe in the service of the core was in the same direction that his father had set him standing. After the war, Reich did not go back home. He, like Freud years before him, moved to one of the centers of the European core, Vienna. In fact, he moved down the street from Freud. Reich was living at 7, Bergassa, Freud was living at 19. Reich studied medicine, and he could have become an allopathic doctor, working, like most allopaths, to contain and control the damage done by the world capitalist system to the body without challenging that world capitalist system. But historical circumstances led to another outcome. Reich was introduced to psychoanalysis through his contact with fellow student Otto Fenichel. Reich took up Freud's notion of libido, an energy of the sexual and life drives that underlies sexual desire with regards to its object, and began his psychoanalytic investigations by studying the functioning of the libido in society. Reich writes about psychoanalysis, quote, "The most solidly formed part is the theory of libido, the doctrine of the dynamics of sexual drives. The source of the libido is a not yet fully understood chemical process in the organism. Above these sources of sexual excitation rises the powerful superstructure, Überbau, of the psychological libido function, which always remains connected to its base and changes together both quantitatively and qualitatively." Reich holds that every aspect of the libido is related to the actual life of the child, such as feeding and excreting. There are two irreducible drives, self-preservation and sexual drives. All other drives are secondary formations. For example, will to power, ambition, the death drive. Reich writes that, quote, "Freud's dictum that the sexual drive first appears in connection with the instinct for nourishment should be of great importance in social psychology. If a relationship can be established between it and Marx's not dissimilar thesis that in social existence the need for food is also the basis for the sexual functions of society," end quote. One can hear in Reich's thoughts about libido two directions in his thinking that will move him into a position of opposition within Freud's regime. First, Reich links libido solidly to the somatic, whereas in psychoanalysis, libido stands more insecurely on the borderline between the somatic and the psychical. Secondly, Reich extends libido theory into the social and ultimately joins it with Marxism.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Can you just rephrase the first point? It seems important. I'm not sure I get it because somatic is not fresh anymore.
Oh, that he links it to the somatic, so that Reich is connecting libido directly to the body, whereas in psychoanalysis it is not so directly connected because libido is a functioning of the mind. He reads Freud's psychoanalysis in a revolutionary manner, something that Freud never dared to do. So let's spend some time exploring Reich's theory of energy. This is the key to the rest of his work. Everything else is based on these symbols. Okay, so we'll start with the orgone symbol. On all of Reich's books, this symbol is printed on the front in the current Farrar, Giraud, and Strauss, I think it's called, the publisher. And this is the symbol, it's a symbol of monism, so that there's a source. And the issue of the source and what's at the source is one of the first things that new Reichians today are going to need to critique, because in Reich, this is an essentialist notion. And essentialist notions don't work today in philosophy, right? We need a materialist notion. So for Reich, that's good. The core is always good, right? But that's essentialist. Out of the core arises an energy, and the energy has two parts that are inextricably connected to it: a physical part and a psychical part, right? So this is a monist theory. This is a body-mind theory, right? And from that arises a practice that is body-mind. Any practice that's only working in the mind is incomplete. Any practice that's only working in the body is incomplete. That pretty much handles most of medicine and psychotherapy, if you believe this. Now let's consider the function of the orgasm. Reich wrote a book called The Function of the Orgasm. The first thing we want to do is we want to move off of a reduction of this word, right? So we're not only thinking of orgasm in terms of, first of all, we're not thinking of it in terms of an ejaculation at all. We're thinking of it as an energetic plateau, all right? And second of all, we're not only thinking of the orgasm as something that is going to happen only during sex. This is the basis of it. This is the Urspring of it. But it's something actually much larger than that. There's a 4-beat formula. There's a tension, which in sex is some kind of mechanical movement. There's a charge in the body, which builds the energy. That rolls over into a discharge, which is just as important in the charge as a charge. And then there's a relaxation, which is just as important as the tension and the charging. So all these parts should be symmetrical. There's a pulsation of orgone energy through the organism. Notice that we've now not using the word libido anymore. He's now going to start to talk about a different word, a different energy, which he's calling orgone. There's a free flow of energy through the body, and the body surrenders. That's an important word. The body surrenders to that free flow of energy. There's a parasympathetic nervous system response. I won't have the time to go into everything that that's about, but that's decreasing the heart rate, decreasing breathing rate, decreasing blood pressure, sexuality, relaxation, creativity. And very importantly, the parasympathetic nervous system stimulates the immune system. It stimulates the immune system to run through the body and defeat disease, pathogens in the body. There's a desire to cathect energy into another and to receive energy from the other. Many of you know what the word cathect means. It's James Strachey's unfortunate translation of the word besetzen. Besetzen just simply means to occupy. So we're going to occupy the other with our energy. Cathect, I think, is a Greek word, if I'm not mistaken. So there is a desire through this 4-beat formula here to get your energy connected into another person and to receive that energy from the other person. There is also, in the function of the orgasm, a desire to connect with the orgone pulse of nature. This is way beyond tree hugging. This is loving trees. This is loving nature. This is desiring with strong libido, strong orgone, a love of the nature. And in fact, a love of the entire universe. At the end of his life, he realizes that orgone is what the entire universe is made up of. And considers that to be human's place in nature. The energy moves around inside the person, and the person wants to, needs to, desires to, is urged towards. It overflows the person to enter into the other person, and then there's a return. That energy is what causes growth and movement inside the person. Now, as part of our rereading, we need to work with this diagram here. As you notice here, Reich has a heterosexual and penetrative notion of this exchange, right? He follows Freud on homosexuality and the passive male and that kind of ridiculousness. So the first thing we need to do is we need to queer this. All right, we need to move off of this limitation here. Luckily, we don't need to move outside of Reich to queer that because it's already there. So one of the first things to understand is that energy, which is not this kind of material, but it's a wave, energy does not need to actually be shoved into somebody else. Energy can be felt moving back and forth between the person. As you know, that's part of what passion is. You can have sex with someone if the sex is penetrative and it could be dead. It could have no energy to it. You could have sex with someone that's not penetrative and it can be amazingly energetic. In fact, it can take you to a plateau of orgasm in the same way that Reich talks about. So, and that person, the two people involved, can be two people of the same gender. They can be people of different genders. They can be people of mixed genders. They could be this gender dressed as that gender, plain as that gender. The thing about this is they can be anything because it's energy. So from within Reich, we really can have a queer sexuality. Unfortunately, that's not how Reich stopped. So that's one of the things we have, that's one of the changes that we have to make with his work. Okay. And this is key. So the energy comes out of the core, and it wants to express itself. However, remember, he said he's talking about this energy in society. So the child, the infant, the child, the adolescent comes into a society that has already a set of rules. It has a certain reality principle based on the ego functioning of that society. And some of the energies are forbidden by society. So society says no to that. And it may punish the child. So the energy is coming out. The society says no. The society punishes the child, and the child may feel some sort of discomfort or pain. But we don't want to feel that. If this happens over and over, pretty soon there's a flinch. The energy starts to come out. You're like, oh, no. Okay. So now we have an interesting situation. We have cathexis, the energy is coming out, but simultaneously we have anti-cathexis. We have sexuality coming out, anxiety coming in. We have an expansion into a society that says no, which then causes the person, due to not wanting to get punished, contraction. Okay. So now we have here a complication. It's not pure anymore. I mean, one of the interesting things about film, especially modern film, is that when they show sexuality, it's typically sex with death, sex with crime, sex with beating, sex with this, sex with that. It's never really just sex. There's always something else going on. And that is in fact depicting the situation of sex in our society today, where the cathexis comes out, but there's always some part that's going, no. Okay? So it's a problematized flow of energy. Well, since we don't like to feel that, we're going to start to stop it before it comes out. And the way we stop it is pretty simple. We tighten our muscles. As the energy starts to come out, as our hand wants to reach around her or him, as our genitals reach out, as our energy comes out, we start to tighten against that energy coming out. And when we do that, for a long period of time in our entire body, we create what Reich called armor. So this is armoring. Right here. In Reichian bodywork, what we do is we put a person on a table and we take our fingers and fists and knuckles and elbows and whatever tool we're going to use, and we're going to sink into the armoring. And we're going to loosen the armoring and hope that the energy can start to come out. And then if we're doing some therapy with it, we can also work with and process and explore the consequences in the person of now having this energy come out. Okay. Energy does not stop. Energy does not stop. Juliet says to Romeo, what are you doing here at the garden? You're going to be killed. And he says, oh, no, love leaps over stone walls. Energy will keep pushing and pushing and pushing. It will not stop. However, it is pushing against armoring. And so in pushing through the armoring, what happens to the love is it gets mutated. It gets distorted from a primary impulse into a secondary impulse. Typically, according to Reich, the secondary impulse is the opposite of the primary impulse. Love, sex, pleasure has turned to violence. Love of the other, the desire to enter into the other, to have the other enter into you in whatever way you understand that, has turned into a desire to push the other away, or even to annihilate the other. In this manner, we start to build a secondary layer of hatred, of violence, of war. If this is social policy, of fascism. This is, according to Reich, the origin of fascism. Obviously, we don't want to reduce it to that. There's a lot more in terms of consciousness going on. There's a lot more in terms of the economics going on. But in terms of what Reich called sex economy, this is the sex economics of it. That is the quantity, how the quantities move through the body. This is the origin of fascism. It's in that secondary impulse. So here's the organism, and it's not that simple, right? It's all kinds of layers inside, right? And we have a parasympathetic or pleasurable expansion out to the world, a breathing out towards the world. And in this world, we have a simultaneous anxious contraction in away from the world. Reich then takes up the question of the Destructionstrieb and the Todestrieb, death drive. A destruction drive to oppose a sexual drive and a death drive to oppose the drive for self-preservation. Now, this looks like a dialectical system. However, Reich has a problem with the death drive because, unlike the sexual drive, it lacks any obvious material foundation. Reich rejects Freud's theory of an organism's desire for dissimulation or decomposition, which Reich calls a matter of formal analogy only. The death drive could be materialist if a real relationship could be found between it and the self-destructive processes in the organism. Instead, in Reich's thinking, the death drive is dependent upon the libido. The death drive is a secondary formation that arises when the self-preservation and sexual drives are not satisfied. It is born from frustration of the materially based drives. Now, you'll notice that Herbert Marcuse and Erich Fromm wrote about this. Well, they got it from Reich. Further, according to Reich, the death drive content is unclear. It refuses to be defined. It is not materialist, and that makes it, quote, an easy loophole for idealistic and metaphysical speculations on the life of the psyche. This assessment will form the basis of Reich's split from psychoanalysis and the groundwork of his own mature theory, orgonomy. In orgonomy, symptoms commonly associated with the externally aggressive death drive, such as violence and war, are considered to be secondary impulses, the result of primary impulses forcing their way through the armoring that is caused by societal prohibitions of the primary drives. While in Vienna, Reich became further radicalized through reading Karl Marx and entered into his Marxist period of theory building. He then left Vienna and moved to Berlin in September 1930. This move can be understood within the world systems framework. Berlin was the core of one of the states contending for hegemony of the core. The contradictions of modernity had split Berlin into the two great opposing forces of the 20th century, fascism and communism, which are locked into a death battle. His critique of capitalist modernity through a Marxist psychoanalysis propels him to move it to the center of the contradiction of the world system. And in 1933, that was here in Berlin. The future was to be decided in Berlin in 1933. He joined the KPD, the Communist Party, and began to develop revolutionary organizations for sexual and social liberation, for according to his body-mind theory, one cannot occur without the other. He writes some of his most radical works during this period, including Dialectical Materialism and Psychoanalysis, 1929, re-edited in 1934. Psychoanalysis in the Soviet Union, 1929. What is Class Consciousness, 1934, along with many pamphlets on sex economy for the masses. He wrote books, The Imposition of Sexual Morality, 1932, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, 1933, and The Sexual Revolution, 1936. Reich writes about the materialist nature of the ego and the doctrine of unconscious repression. The reality principle, in whose interest the ego works, remains, according to Reich, formalistic, unless it makes full allowance for the fact that the reality principle as it exists today is only the principle of our capitalist, or rather, private property society. It imposes upon the proletarian a maximum limitation of his needs while appealing to religious values, such as modesty and humility. It imposes a monogamous form of sexuality. All this is founded upon economic conditions. In a discussion of the repression of childhood wishes and drives, Reich writes, quote, "Thus we can see that psychoanalysis cannot conceive of the child without society. The child exists only as a being within society. The social existence is ideologically concentrated. Large portions of it are unconscious." For Reich, psychoanalysis has a complementary task to that of Marxism. Marx's theory of society was obliged to leave the question, in what way does social ideology affect the individual, open, because it was outside of its sphere. Instead, the answer came from psychoanalysis. Reich posits a necessary critical partnership between psychoanalysis and Marxism. Reich's 1933 book, Die Massenpsychologie des Faschismus, which takes up the basic notions from Freud's 1921 study, Massenpsychologie und Ich-Analyse, and radicalizes them. It's a good example of his work at this time, and let's spend a minute on it. So this is Freud, 21. The individual in a group is subjected through influence to a profound alteration of his mental activity. Liability to affect is intensified, intellectual ability is reduced, there is a removal of inhibitions upon drives, the group is held together by the power of love. Exercised as the cathecting of libido upon a common object, a leader or ideal, the nation, the folk, etc. There is also an expression of a narrative that the leader loves each individual back. Christ loves you. Trump will get your jobs back. The individuals also love each other as one who loves the leader. This is an identification with the father in the Oedipus triangle, also figures into the group formation. This is like hypnosis. There's a humble subjection, compliance, and absence of criticism towards the hypnotist as towards the loved object. There is the same sapping of the subject's initiative. For Freud, a primary group of this kind is a number of individuals who have put one and the same object in the place of their ego ideal, and have consequently identified themselves one with the other in their ego. But this entire process is non-sexual. Two people being sexual with each other works against the herd drive. They cathect libido into each other at the expense of the leader. So mass psychology must not include actual sex between the followers. And here's where Reich picks up the thread. The lack of sexual relations mentioned by Freud occurs because of a suppression of sexuality, a suppression of the free flow of libido, or orgone as Reich now conceives it. The suppression is achieved actively through social prohibition. Armoring develops. The energy pushes against the armor and becomes mutated into a secondary drive that is fascist, violent, and hateful. Reich writes that, quote, race ideology is a pure biopathic expression of the character structure of the orgastically impotent man. Erich Fromm takes this one step further in describing the necrophiliac character type, with Adolf Hitler as being his exemplary necrophile. We have other ones today. The followers of fascism have become alienated from their own source of sexual energetic flow through inhibition and frustration. They lost their self-confidence. They seek the power and self-confidence in the leader, but this process makes them even more alienated from their power and exacerbates the problem. Fascism is brimming with the harnessed sexual energy of its participants. Reich writes in 1942 in a preface to the book Mass Psychology of Fascism, when this book was first written, fascism was generally regarded as a political party, which as other social groups advocated an organized political idea. According to this appraisal, the fascist party was instituting fascism by means of force or through political maneuver. Contrary to this, my medical experiences with men and women of various classes, races, nations, religious beliefs, etc., taught me that fascism is only the organized political expression of the structure of the average man's character. A structure that is confined neither to certain races or nations or certain parties, but is general and international. Viewed with respect to man's character, fascism is the basic emotional attitude of the suppressed man, of our authoritarian machine civilization, and its mechanistic, mystical conception of life, end quote. At this critical juncture in history of the world system, in 1933, in this critical place in Berlin, Reich presented the victims of the system a way out. Look to your naturally sourced energy, which provides desire for your life drives and urges you to connect lovingly to others and labor for them in concert in a work democracy. Let that be your revolutionary fervor. Oppose anything that gets in the way of the flow of that energy. This means capitalism, which creates artificial scarcity and poverty, denies workers access to enough food and housing and leisure time to be free-flowing, loving, energetic beings, which alienates the body and mind from its own labor and life drive. Oppose fascism, which wants to bind the bodies and mind of the population with the authoritarian state. Oppose petty bourgeois morality, which fears childhood and adolescent sexuality and ultimately works in the interest of the ruling class. This opposition was not to be carried out by force, by shouting anti-fa slogans in the fascist ears, but through healing the fascist. Through, quote, finding the elements of health that are spontaneously present in the sick organism, through developing the actual conditions of freedom that are present, and to eliminate the obstacles that thwart this development, end quote. Now, Reich's challenge to the capitalist world order, to its economic, social, sexual order, would of course be strongly and violently opposed by those in power, and those who in 1933 were about to come to power. Conversely, his radical union of psychoanalysis and Marxism should have been welcomed and supported by the two constituent movements. He was, after all, taking Freud's sexually based theory of the mind seriously, and he was offering the communists a practice by which they could effectively radicalize consciousness. Yet, instead of supporting him, or even tolerating him, both psychoanalysts and the Marxists attacked Reich and threw him out of their organizations. The same type of Marxists, undialectical ones in Reich's view, who opposed psychoanalysis also opposed Reich's political work. They began to write against him in their official organs, and by 1932 the party prohibited the distribution of Reich's books. In 1933, Reich was thrown out of the communist parties, including the Danish Communist Party, of which he was never a member of. Things were no better in psychoanalysis. So that's Reich being thrown out of the Psychoanalytic Congress in Lucerne in 1934. Anna Freud led an attack on Reich, which resulted in his expulsion from the psychoanalytic organization at the Lucerne Congress. Prominent in this attack were Ernest Jones, Paul Fedrum, and Freud himself. Freud asked the International Journal of Psychoanalysis to prefix one of Reich's articles with a statement that he was a member of the Bolshevik Party. Reich had hit a nerve in the two constituent movements, Marxism and psychoanalysis, that caused them to reject his reading of them and the praxis he developed from this reading. An exploration of the history of this rejection serves to expose those methods, psychoanalysis and Marxism, as unsuitable as radical challenges to the world system at that time. And indeed, the communists failed to stem fascism in 1933. In the Soviet sphere, they set up what Reich called red fascist regimes, which were run by men just as armored as the black fascists. Part of Germany suffered under such a regime here. In 1989, world communism collapsed even in its pretense of being a radical challenge to capitalism. Psychoanalysis has been more open to self-reflection. In fact, most of the post-structuralists developed their theories partly through a critical reading of psychoanalysis. However, that field is still not dared to be open to the challenge that Reich delivered to it. But this didn't stop Reich. Exiled in Scandinavia, he moved on to study and develop his radical practice, orgonomy. Every step that he takes in developing the theory is rooted in the notion that health is based upon a free flow of energy and the healthy character that it constructs. I'll just talk only about his cancer research. According to Reich, cancer is caused by compression. Tumors are caused by compression. I don't have time to go into it, but in other lectures, I talk about how compression creates growth in the body. The compression comes from the armory. The compression causes a cellular starvation of nutrients. They don't get to the cells. Of oxygen, it doesn't get to the cell. Of orgone. Reich says the cancer cell is a poorly breathing cell. The sympathetic nervous system, the anxiety nervous system, causes an inhibition of the immune system. Probably most of you have heard about natural killer cells. Yeah, so they kill cancer. Because the way that they work is they run around inside the body and they have one question and one question only. Do I know you? If I don't know you, I kill you. That's how the NK cell works. So what is it that it doesn't know? Mutated cells, neoplasms, right? And this is a badass army. It's a very powerful army. But if it's inhibited by all of this that we're talking about here, then it doesn't work and the cancer grows inside the body. Cancer is a result of biopathy, a disturbance of the biological function of pulsation in the total organism, disturbance in the discharge of biosexual excitation, biopathic shrinking, chronic preponderance of contraction and inhibition of the expansion in the autonomic nervous system, poor external respiration, which leads to a disturbance of the internal respiration in tissues, chronic spasm of the musculature, especially the annular muscles, the diaphragms and sphincters, chronic orgastic impotence. Notice that the same conditions that lead to fascism lead to cancer. During his investigation of orgone energy, Reich attempted to isolate it in order to study it. He was unsuccessful at this because he found that orgone was everywhere. You can't isolate it. So what he did instead is he accumulated it. And he came up with this box that he built. First he worked with small ones and then larger ones, which are varying layers of organic and inorganic materials, which serve to concentrate the orgone inside the box. His experiments led him to consider the accumulator as a tool in the treatment of cancer. So a word on the orgone accumulator. One, you don't sit in here and have orgasms. I don't know how many people have come up to me and said, is Reich the guy who had a box that you sat inside and had orgasms? No, that's not what you do in there. Two, this is not a cure for cancer. This is a tool in working to accumulate energy in the body. In fact, it's not even the primary thing that Reichian body workers use. I've never used an orgone accumulator, not because I'm against them, but because at the level of work that I do, I don't need to. I use my hands. I use therapy. I use breathing. Right? The treatment of cancer consists in helping the person breathe again by loosening the armoring in the body. This treatment is partly physical and partly psychotherapeutic. In fact, it is body-mind. However, treating the sick individual is not effective because the source of the problem is social. Individuals are forced to shrink before authorities, and the dominant authority in the world capitalist system is the imperative to accumulate profit through the exploitation of human labor power. This system does not allow its workers time to lie around and make love with each other, time for relaxation, time for free movement. Instead, it locks them either into the factory or the field work in the case of the periphery, or office work in the case of the core. The self-employed are always chasing the sale. The capitalists are always chasing the profit. The unemployed and homeless don't have a place to relax. War ravages in some places on the earth, effectively erasing any chance of health there. Therefore, the cure for cancer is revolution. The abolishment of the world capitalist system. Let's take a moment now to think about the cosmic and planetary studies that he moved into. Reich opened his study on the cosmos, a 1951 text called Cosmic Superimposition, with this line. The basic interest of the subject in the subject of this publication is human and not primarily astrophysical. On what manner is man rooted in nature? This is the question around which the theme revolves. Reich postulated that orgone energy is the basis of the universe. Instead of being a vacuum, the universe is actually an expanse of cosmic orgone energy. He held that galaxies displayed the process of superimposition. Two energy streams move towards each other, as two humans do in freely loving sexuality. They superimpose upon contact, curve into a spiral, and merge. This, according to Reich, is the process of the creation of mass. Now, not being a physicist, I have little to comment on this that would be scholarly. As an amateur reader of quantum physics, I think he may have been onto something, but I can't really comment beyond that. However, as an allegory for what two bodies do in love, this makes sense to me. They are drawn towards each other, they contact, they spiral around each other. I think about a kiss, right? Armored bodies, on the other hand, resist the draw, avoid the contact, or do it forcefully, and don't let go to the mutual spiraling. Reich also considered how orgone itself could become sick. He stumbled upon this when he tried to counter nuclear radiation by radiating orgone onto it. He ended up getting everybody in the laboratory sick. He labeled the unhealthy orgone DOR, deadly orgone radiation. Orgone is just energy, but it becomes unhealthy when it is affected by the toxicity of another unhealthy energy force, such as nuclear radiation. DOR affects the atmosphere by making it dreary and heavy. the sort of atmospheric conditions that we feel in many major cities. Reich discovered that he could disperse DOR clouds by directing at them hollow tubes which were connected to flowing water. In this manner, he also discovered that he could create clouds by drawing energy of an area adjacent to a cloud. This caused the cloud to build and then to rain. He successfully made rain in 1953 in Maine and in 1954 in the desert in Arizona. Reich wrote a few short lines about deserts. He made an analogy between desertification of the planet and emotional deadness in humans. Some contemporary Reichians are following up on this research in interesting ways. However, it was none of these physics experiments that got Reich in trouble with the hegemonic core, with the United States. It was his cancer research. It was his medicine. Reich had endured near constant attacks on his work almost from the moment it began. He must have been doing something right. The psychoanalysts attacked him, the vulgar Marxists attacked him, the Scandinavians attacked him for being a pornographer. The Americans wrote yellow journals about him. All the hostility, including the falsehoods and rumors, were taken up by a conspiracy of the American psychiatric movement and the American medical movement in concert with the US government, specifically the FDA, to silence Reich and destroy his work. An FDA investigation of Reich's work began in 1947. He was accused of conducting a sexual racket and promoting a fraudulent cancer cure. In 1954, the FDA served Reich with an injunction to stop delivering medical equipment, the Orgone accumulators, across state lines or through interstate commerce. Reich told the court that it was not qualified to adjudicate on scientific matters. He appealed to have the injunction stricken. He lost and was arrested. His books were banned in the United States. His books were incinerated in the United States. In 1956, Reich was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He went to Lewisburg Penitentiary in Pennsylvania and died in prison of heart failure on November 2nd, 1957. His work continued quietly for a while after his work, but it really began to surface again in the popular consciousness during the general uprising against the world capitalist system that we call the 1960s. Both the hippies and the New Left were influenced by Reich. However, they may not have known that it was Reich. They were more likely to have been aware of Herbert Marcuse, whose work displays a strong influence from Reich. The opposition of a peaceful sexual revolution to both the capitalist and the communist Stalinist power-based state is a position the 60s sourced from Reich. Reich's sex economic work surfaces again at the outbreak of May 68 uprising as the text that the students were reading at Nanterre when they demanded that the university lift its sexually repressive rules. The first demonstrations were sparked by a Reichian reading group. The kids from the Sorbonne and the French workers joined in as a response to the police violence, and May 68 then blossomed into the significant political movement in the history of the system. One of the core differences between the New Left and the hippies is whether one should fight the power or drop out of the power system and live alternatively. These two options are opposite and construct different characters. Since only an army can defeat an army, and the capitalists are not going to give up without a fight, the New Left has to create effective fighters and strategists to win the class war. Yet Reich has shown that bodies that fight are anxious and end up armored. The hippies, on the other hand, preferred to let their bodies be soft and unarmored. They attempted to construct peaceful characters that lived in the manner that they wanted for the future. Theirs was a utopian strategy, but they failed. Part of them were imprisoned. Part of them were ignored, which Reich held that being ignored could be worse than being opposed. Part of them were taken up by the capitalists to be packaged and sold back to the masses through the process of repressive desublimation. Thomas Pynchon captures this defeat in his novel Inherent Vice. Describing the main character towards the end of the novel, Pynchon writes, "And here was Doc on the natch, caught in a low-level bummer he couldn't find a way out of, about how the psychedelic 60s, this little parentheses of light, might close after all, and all be lost, taken back into the darkness. How a certain hand might reach terribly up out of the darkness and reclaim the time, easy as taking a joint from a doper and stubbing it out for good." This is exactly what happened. By the 1970s, just as neoliberalism was rising ascendant, the New Age and the New Left had been defeated. After that, Reichian work barely survived in the sidelines of an individualistic, commodified healing and spirituality movement called the New Age movement. It was during this time that I launched from home and entered into the healing world. I came across Reichian work in 1987. Luckily, I encountered a Marxist Reichian who became my teacher. There are many splinter groups in the Reichian world today. Many of them, especially in the US, position themselves on the right wing of certain issues. What I'm proposing are two actions. One, at the level of psychotherapy and somatic therapy and medicine, I propose that we reconsider Reich's work. Well, body-mind work has been around since the 80s at least, but it's sometimes haphazard and not as well unified as Reichian therapy. Both therapists and body workers have much to learn from Reich's texts. Obviously, we must reject Big Pharma and its allopathic conspirators who treat symptoms and keep the victims of capitalism ready for exploitation. Obviously, we must reject the geneticist narrative about diseases that are actually socially caused. Less obviously, but very important, we need to radicalize. And by this, I mean work to the root of the problem of our holistic healing methods. Healing must be guided by solid theory and practice, not by mere intuition or worse, sloppy laziness. Reich worked diligently for decades to uncover the source of our discontent. And it isn't civilization as such, it's capitalist civilization specifically. My second proposal is that those of us who work in critical theory need to take up Reich's texts and mine them for useful ideas and method. We will find much that we don't like, and we can critique this. Reich needs to be queered. He needs to be set in the context of more recent developments in psychoanalysis. I'm particularly interested in the work of Laplanche. His Marxist writings need to be understood within the history of Marxism, especially as texts that critique Marxism as a critical period in its development in 1933. Today, Reich's critique is more relevant than ever. The world capitalist system has created armies of the death drive. Necrophilic characters fighting not only in regular armies, but also in the armies of terror, who are indirectly encouraged by the hegemonic core. The world faces a serious problem: how to face the other without feeling the need to annihilate him and her. I would like to see someone read Reich through Hegel and explore the dialectics of the self and the other in Reich's energetic practice. The most recent hegemonic core, the US, has taken a turn backwards in an anachronistic rejection of modernity, the fascist armored characters of Trump's army. This is also having a resurgence here in Europe. Reich's radical psychoanalytic energetics can help us understand how to heal this. Yes, I mean heal fascism. Punching fascism does not get rid of fascism. Violent anti-fa energy is just as armored as what it opposes. Reich proposed that fascism is a problem not only of the political mind, which limits us to an investigation of the conscious processes, but of the unconscious and of the body. To work at the root of fascism is to find out the muscular armoring of the sexually frustrated anti-cathexis. And we don't need to force this theory onto the current situation. The current situation has forced it onto us. The world capitalist system has taken control not only of our labor power and our ideology, but it has brought under its sway our bodies, our physiological functioning. Our every step is measured, quantified, and delivered to big data for commercial exploitation. The better capitalism gets at controlling us, the more it shows us where we need to look for the solution. At this point, I could end this talk with the slogan, "Free your ass, and your mind will follow." But that would be, right? But that would be the hippie solution, and it doesn't work. Alternatively, I could say, "Down with capitalism, fight the power." But that would armor us, and it doesn't work. Instead, I suggest that we use a rereading of Reich's work to work through this contradiction and find the path that will allow us to prevent fascism and abolish the inhumane world capitalist system. And I'll stop there. And we can have a discussion.